Anyone here been to Bakers and Barista? Show of hands. Bakers and Barista down the street. Cool spot. Cool spot for food and coffee. I know some of you are just like way too hipster for me. I'm not going there. You know, it's cool. It's an enjoyable place. I go there a lot, just kind of work on stuff. I was there a few weeks ago. I was actually there this morning, but I was there a few weeks ago just working on stuff, and I'm just trying to wrap up Exodus, and I'm just trying to like spend my own time just kind of studying and preparing. You know, I'll kind of sneak in a prayer without being too awkward, you know, and I'll just kind of work on that stuff there. And then I get a call from my sister, and the music's like kind of loud in there, and so I'm on the phone, and then she says, Mom and Dad were in a car accident, and it's pretty bad. And, you know, it's like when you hear news like that, you know, she didn't waste any time. She didn't say, how's it going, you know, what's going on. She didn't do any of that. She just said, they're in an accident, it's bad. And so when you hear news like that, it's like being hit by a freight train. It's hard. Who can handle that well, you know, the second they hear it? And so I then said, okay, where are they? And then she said, they were rushed to the hospital. I don't know which hospital yet. And I wanted to ask her a million questions, but I knew it was just at the right time. And so I just said, okay, what do you want me to do? And then she just says, just stand by your phone and wait for me to call back, which is like one of the worst things you can hear in a situation like that. And so I packed up my stuff at Baker's, and I just drove home. And it takes me about 10 minutes to get home, but that 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. Not knowing, you know, where they were, not knowing their condition, you know, and just being in the dark like that. You know, every second, every minute it's just forever. And so it's like the longest drive home that I ever made. And so I finally get home. I get into the house, like, what am I going to do? I just kind of sit there with the phone in my hand. I don't know what happened. I literally don't know what is happening to my parents. I mean, I'm sure you can use your imagination. Anything could happen from car accidents. All she told me was that they're in a car accident and it was bad. I would have loved just a text, you know, they're okay, something, but I get nothing. And so that little kind of moment in time during the day when I'm waiting for her to call back, it's just like torture, because I have no control over anything. I mean, you get me when I say that. There's nothing I could do. I can't go to the hospital. I don't know where they are. I can't help. I can't talk to the doctors. I can't talk to anybody. I don't know what's going on. And so it's a time when I have absolutely no control. And so I finally get a call back from my sister, and she tells me which hospital it is. It's the Los Alamitos Medical Center, and so I rush over there, and they're okay. My dad was okay. He just kind of had a sore neck. My mom was in the ER room, and she had a sore neck and a banged-up knee. But considering what had happened in the accident, thank God that they're okay. I mean, their car was totaled. And it turned out that a lady, for one reason or another, ran a red light, and so my parents ended up T-boning the other lady's car, and I think the other lady is okay. It's just a miracle, just everyone's okay. But I look at the car and look at them, I'm just like, I can't believe you guys are okay. And, you know, they're getting chiropractic care, and they're recovering, and they're good, and they're well. But I realized that during that time, I had no control over my parents driving. I had no control over the fact that some lady or some person running a red light. I have no control over that. I have no control over what the doctors see in their scan or what they diagnose. I have no control if they would have passed away, if they would have ended up in a coma, if they would have ended up paralyzed. I have no control over that whatsoever. Me being a better son would have nothing to do with that. Me being a better pastor would have nothing to do with that. Me reading my Bibles 10 minutes a day versus 10 hours a day, that would have nothing to do with that. Nothing I could do in my power, in my time, in my abilities would have helped them in that situation. And if there was even a millisecond difference in that accident, I mean, they would have easily passed. Just the force and the destruction of that accident, I mean, any split second would have had a different result. And so there are things in this life that I have no control over. I mean, church, can you hear me when I say that? There are things in this life that I have no control over. And that is also true for you. And so when James writes, in a very sobering and a very honest way, that we face trials of various kinds, I hear what he's saying. That little moment during the day, that time, was a trial of a various kind. And there are a lot of things that we cannot control, but there are things that we can control. I may not be able to control what happens to my parents in a car accident or whatever it is, but I can control how I respond. I can control how I respond to that circumstance, what I do, what I say. Those are things that I can respond to. And in those moments where anything can happen, what is a Christian supposed to do? If a Christian can control his or her response biblically, or the best that you can answer, what is a Christian supposed to do? You see, a Christian can push God away, can get angry at God, can get distant at God, can run away from God. A Christian can get pissed off at God and just say, God, get the heck out of my way. This is my thing. I need to control this. I need to do this. James says, count it all joy. And then he says, ask God for wisdom. And I want to be careful when I say that because maybe some of you are in a place right now where you feel like there are things that you cannot control. And maybe you are running away from God, and maybe you are drifting away from God, maybe you are pissed off at God, maybe God is real to you, but you want to have nothing to do with him. And so when I say, or when James says, count it all joy, maybe your response is, you've got to be kidding me. How in the world can I count that as joy? Ask God for wisdom after what he's put me through? And so if we're going to dig a little bit, honestly, church, it's a very real letter that he's writing. And it really causes you to think a little bit. It causes you to kind of go through this message a little bit, and you know it's going to be kind of difficult to handle. It's not this nice, warm, God is loving, God is grace kind of message, but it's a kind of message, like in the way we started our worship today, it's a kind of message that calls you to think a little bit, and maybe it's going to hurt a little bit. But what I can say for sure is that you do have a choice on how you respond to trials in your life. And no one can take that choice away from you. That is the premise of James's letter. And so I want to share that kind of real life story with you because that's what James is writing about. And these real life stories, these real life struggles, is kind of this hands-on faith that James is talking about. These are tackling real life issues. And one of those real life issues that he's talking about is trials. And he says in verse 2, count it all joy when you meet trials. Not if you meet trials, but when you meet trials. And so the reality is that if you're a Christian, you will go through trials and you will go through temptations. The reality is you're going to be in moments and possibly entire seasons of your life when you have no control. If you're a Christian, the reality is that God is going to challenge you in the way you do relationships. Relationships with friends, relationship with family, relationship with people you love, relationships with boyfriends, relationship with girlfriends. God is going to challenge you in the relationships that you have in your covenant community here at church, the relationship that you have with your small groups. God is going to challenge you with those things. The reality is if you're a Christian, God is going to challenge you in the way you view money. And I know that we like to not talk about money. We like to make this huge dichotomy between the Christian life and money. Money, for some reason, is the super privatized thing that we don't like to talk about. It's my money. I'll do what I want with it. You can't tell me to do with my money, but God is going to challenge you with that. How you view money, how you spend money, how you make money, how you give money. The reality is that if you're a Christian, God is going to challenge you in the way you view personal resources. Resources like what? Personal space, your home, your car, your education. Are those things gifts from God, or do you actually believe that you've earned those things? The reality is, as James will say, God is going to challenge you in the way you speak. Is something simple as your tongue really that important? Do you use it to build up or do you use it to break down? And so I think when we think about who is in this room as we're confronting this letter, I think there's two kinds of people. And I think if you're young, maybe in your faith, and maybe you haven't had your share of struggles, maybe you haven't seen or experienced tough trials in your family, maybe you've never been in a situation where you had to question God, that might be you. Or maybe you're a little bit more seasoned, you've been through a little bit of fire. But I think either way, wherever you are on the spectrum, you're going to start asking the same question that we've been asking for a long time, and it's a loaded question. Why? I mean, if the reality is, if we're Christian and God is going to put us through trials and difficulties and challenges, why? And it's a loaded question, but this is how James answers it. He says in verse 3, "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." And so think about that word testing. James writes that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. I'm going to be a little bit honest here, okay? It takes a lot of courage for me to say this, okay? But I'm not good at tests. I'm not good at exams. There, I said it. Okay, don't judge me. I know I'm Asian. I know I'm supposed to be good at tests, but I'm not, okay? I'm more of a paper, presentation, kind of projects type of guy. I tear those up, okay? But I still have flashbacks and nightmares of the SATs, which was like hundreds of years ago for me. I still have nightmares about that because I hate tests. There's something about exams that doesn't sit right with me. I freeze up. I can't think. Right? And so when James brings up this idea of testing, and I'm going to be honest with this, and I'm trying to jive with James, I'm trying to think about what he's talking about, and he says, the testing of your faith, the midterms, the finals of your faith. Why can't it be some group project of your faith? Like, that would have been a lot nicer for me. But that's not what James is talking about, because the word testing has a little bit of a nuance that we have to understand. He's not talking about a midterm or a final or an exam. The word testing has to do with the idea of examining what is pure and what is genuine. Putting pressure on something, putting fire on something so that you know if something is real. When James uses the word testing, it has a lot to do with mining. Mining as in digging out precious metals. And so if you think about this idea of concept, which is a very biblical concept about how gold is refined. You know, gold, if you're wearing gold today, you got to understand that if you're wearing high quality gold, it didn't just end up somehow in the jewelry store and you fork out a bunch of money and now you're blinging it. That's not how it works. Gold comes from the earth. And if it doesn't come from the earth, you're wearing fake gold. I'm sorry to tell you. Real gold, genuine gold, good, high quality, expensive gold comes from the earth. And when they dig out gold and they're mining and they're digging and digging and digging, a lot of the times it's just rocks. It's rocks after rocks until they hit something pure and they'll dig out gold. But it's not just pure gold. Rarely is it ever pure gold. What they'll do is they'll dig out a whole bunch of rocks and with it might be gold, and then they'll put it to intense fire. Fire and fire and fire, and it's so intense that it starts to heat up the gold that it melts. In fact, it starts to boil, and in that process, they'll start to get out all the impurities, all the other rocks that you don't want in gold, until you're left with something that is pure. And then they'll do it again. And they'll boil out all the impurities until you're left with something even more pure. And then they'll do it again, and then they'll do it again. That process is called refinement. You see, that's a testing of the gold. You put intense fire that is so intense to the point that it tests the genuineness and the purity of the gold until you're left with something that is not just more beautiful, but even stronger than before. That the integrity of the gold is actually that much stronger. That's what James is talking about. The testing of your faith. You're not put to the test like it's an exam. You're put to the test in that God puts intense fire in your life. And then you come out of it more beautiful and stronger. And then what happened? God does it again and again and again. And he says, count it all joy. Count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, because it produces in you a steadfastness. Church, what does it mean for a Christian to be steadfast? Simply put, it means to trust in God, which I know is a loaded statement, right? Steadfastness means you are anchored in God and not yourself. Isn't it easier to be a Christian when things are easier? When money is good, loving God is easier. You know what I'm saying? When relationships are good, you're not in an argument, you're not fighting with everyone, being a Christian is easier. Loving people is easier. When your classes are going well and you're just cruising through your classes, and assignments and tests that seem to be going well and you're doing well and you're getting all the grades that you want, being a Christian is easier. Community is easier. Church is easier. Worship is easier. When job is going well and there's a lot of opportunities for you to grow and you're making good money, being a Christian is so much easier. But when you're squeezed, and when the pressure is on, and when circumstances get tough, and then living out your faith then becomes a challenge, your perspective of God also gets challenged. Your perspective of the gospel gets challenged. And so it's good that we ask the question, why do we suffer? Because we need to understand that without suffering, God wouldn't even be on our radar. Without suffering, we're prone to wander. Without suffering, I think God would just be an accessory on Sundays. I mean, it's a sad truth, but I think that's just true for all of us. If there are no trials and there's no challenges in our life, church, our faith, God, it becomes something that we put on like a Sunday shirt or a Sunday dress. But when James says count it all joy, he's saying count it all joy because when God puts you through suffering, it's because He loves you. Sometimes that's just the only way God can get our attention. Now, even if James spells it out, I think some of us have a hard time accepting that. Maybe you've come to the conclusion that suffering in your life happens because God is punishing you. Maybe you weren't the best Christian in the past and now you're paying for it. You mistreated someone. Maybe you mistreated a family or a friend. You hurt someone physically or verbally. Maybe you committed adultery somehow, some way, and you haven't told anyone about it. And so maybe now you come into church, there's you want to worship, you want to connect, but you just feel like God is distancing Himself from you because you've done some gravest sin. Maybe you're hanging out with friends and you drank too much and you did stupid things, regrettable things. And you knew that if everyone at church knew that you had a drinking problem, you drank too much, that you would be judged, and so you don't talk about it. And God doesn't like it, and so you just feel like this God is just angry at you and He's punishing you. And whatever happens in your life now, you just feel like, well, God is getting back at me. You see, the reason we think that way is because that's how we think. And that's natural, right? We think that way because we feel like that's how other people think of us. And so there is this process where we think that if God is anything like me, then God's going to look at my sin and He's going to say, how can you seriously call yourself a Christian? And so you do all that, and you look at that, and God says, after all that I've done for you, how many times have you heard the gospel? How many times have you been to church? How many times have you done and seen and heard and done church and all these things, and you're still doing these things? Well, then, of course, God is just going to get tired of grace and forgiveness and mercy, of course. Church, I want you to be clear on this. If you believe in the lordship of Jesus Christ, then you have to believe that Jesus took it all. If you believe that God looks at sin and He is disgusted, I mean, let's not even sugarcoat it when we say sin. When I say sin, I'm not just talking about the blatant sins and the things that you do. I'm talking about even sins of the heart. That you think God looks at your private moments when you're all by yourself, what you think and what you do when no one else is watching. And you think God looks at that and you think that is absolutely disgusting. And if I can just show you a mirror of what you're thinking and what you're doing, you're going to tell me you're a Christian? You see, does God get disgusted at sin? Absolutely. Does God consider you an enemy if you just commit spiritual adultery all the time? Absolutely. And there is wrath, and there is anger, and there is judgment, and there is punishment. There's all of that. But when we look at the wonder and the beauty of the gospel, when we look at what James, the half-brother of Jesus, saw his older brother dying on the cross, and seeing the spiritual reality and seeing the substitution of Christ's righteousness in our sin, when we look at that, you see, we see the wrath, we see the judgment, we see the disgust of God being poured out on His Son, Jesus Christ. All of it. And then when God looks at your sin, yes, there is this, I don't like the sin, and there is this disgust, but that was all poured out on Jesus. So what does that mean then for us? No matter how many times I say this on Sundays, I feel like we still need to hear it. There is an absence of guilt. There is fear. There is shame that is just destroyed. And that we can allow fear and guilt to creep into our theology, but what we understand about the gospel is that it says, well, if Jesus took it all, then what is left for me? But that we can reap the benefits of Jesus Christ. And that, yes, we're going to sin, but God is after our hearts and He pursues us. And He says that there's repentance, that there's grace. And so the gospel gives us this freedom in our suffering. And so how do we actually go through suffering then? And if the gospel fuels us and it gives us the right picture of God and the right picture of ourselves, how do we go through suffering here and now? James says, ask for wisdom. He says in verse 8, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Now, follow me here. I'm going to read verse 5 again. But before I do, I want to challenge you to not jump the gun and get all super crazy theological, at least not yet. As much as you can, I want you to approach verse 5 with as much simplicity and with as much honesty as possible. Okay, can we do that, church? I'm going to read verse 5. I just want you to be really honest with it. I'm not asking you to say anything, just in your head. I know we're all Asian and we're timid, so we don't want to say amen and stuff like that. Okay, I'll give that to you. Just think that in your head. Be Christian in your head. Can you do that? Okay, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, stop. Just stop. Okay? Let's not even jump the gun and get all crazy, super theological. Just, if any of you lacks wisdom. Let's be real with that. Who here lacks wisdom? Honestly. If you lack wisdom, I think if we think about that, we'll come to realize that there are some really clear things in our lives that we need wisdom for. Let's kind of lay aside our pride and think about what we need wisdom for. Wisdom in how we do relationships, right? How many of us, we're just in this friendship, boyfriend, girlfriend, family, whatever it is, right? And in that relationship, somehow, some way, you just end up like doing this, like you think about it, you're not even talking to that person. And for some reason, you just end up like, what? Like you're just like confused with this person, right? What is wrong with this person? And so you need wisdom in that. You need wisdom on how to do relationships at church. People in your small groups, covenant community members, even me. Why is Pastor Howard doing that? Why does he have to say it like that? And you have these like conflicts in your relationships. You need wisdom in how you like be a Christian in the secular workplace. How do you do that? Like it's easier to be Christian at church because everyone's a Christian, I think, and we just do a bunch of Christian stuff, but then I go to work, right? And everyone's talking about like happy hour and getting drunk after work. They're talking about, what they want to do with their partner sexually, and what are we going to do with all these things? So how are you going to be a Christian in the workplace? Are you going to be the Christian that says, oh, I don't do that, sorry. Let me go hide back into my little Christian corner and just do my QT all day in front of my computer. Like, is that going to be you? Is that how we function as Christians in the secular workplace? Don't we need wisdom over something like that? What about wisdom over something like family? Like, how many of us are Christians living in a non-Christian family? And I mean that when I say that because I grew up in a Christian home, and so I honestly don't know what that's like. Like, I can talk to my parents about ministry in a very real way because my dad is a retired elder. We can talk about that stuff. That makes sense to me. I can't imagine striving to be a disciple of Jesus Christ in a home and in a family where there are no disciples. Don't we need wisdom over things like that? And so when James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, for show me. James, I need wisdom. Like, I'm not just trying to be dramatic here, like literally me. I need wisdom in that. I mean, can we really just lay aside our pride and stop acting like we know a thing or two about Christianity and just be real with the text here and hear him honestly speaking with his heart? And when he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, yes, me, I need wisdom. And when James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, that's all of us all the time. And then he says, let him ask God. Why? Because God gives generously. God gives generously to all without reproach. That's a powerful verse because you're not going to find a lot of verses in the Bible like that, straight up. Okay? And I want to be careful here because I'm not preaching a prosperity gospel. I'm not saying ask God for anything, He'll give it to you. Okay? But James specifically says wisdom. How many times in the Bible will you ever hear the Bible say, if you ask for this specifically, God will give it to you generously? You don't find a lot of Bible verses like that. We want to believe that. And we want to kind of twist it and to think, so if I ask God for wisdom, well then in my wisdom, I need Jordans. And so, okay, God, I'm going to ask for Jordans because I'm wise, hook it up. Right? No, James is not talking about just ask God for whatever and He'll give it to you. He's asking about wisdom. And so we're going to think on that, church. Take a second and think, what does it mean then to ask for wisdom? Because, in the most honest way possible, it's a difficult prayer. How do you ask wisdom if you're in a fight with someone and you know you're right? You know in the most profound and deepest way possible, in your gut and in your soul, whatever that means, you know that you are right in the argument. And so if you are right in the argument, it's an ongoing argument, and you are getting fed up with this person because they are being stubborn, they know you're wrong, they know they're wrong, and you know you're right, and you go to God and you say, God, I'm asking for wisdom. Help me to find a way to demolish this guy with my argument. Is that wisdom? No. How do you ask for wisdom when you're in a fight with someone you love and you know you're right? How do you ask for wisdom when you'd rather be comfortable than holy? When you'd rather be physically more comfortable, financially more comfortable, and in that you ask for wisdom. What does that mean? How do you ask for wisdom? Like, would you rather indulge and kind of lose self-control and just enjoy the experience, the momentary experience, or would you rather ask for wisdom? When you ask for wisdom, listen to me, you are entering into God's economy. When you ask for wisdom, you are going to God and you are saying, yeah, I guess I don't know anything. I'm jacked up. I don't know what I'm doing. I think I know what I'm doing, but I don't. I need your wisdom. And so it's such a simple thing that James is saying, if anyone lacks wisdom, ask for it, but it's profound and it's a difficult prayer. Asking for wisdom is not asking God to change your circumstances. Asking for wisdom, really asking honestly, is going to God and saying, you are wisdom. Not just, I'm going to stick in a little quarter and God's going to give me a nugget of wisdom like he's this little machine. No, but God himself is wisdom. If God himself is wisdom, if Jesus Christ himself is wisdom, how do we seek wisdom? You seek out Jesus. And so, here's how we can apply this. I think there are some young believers in here. And hear me when I say this. I think there are young believers in here, and I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of. When I say young believers, I don't mean physically young, but I mean spiritually young. You just haven't had a whole lot of life experience. You just haven't had a lot of time in your spiritual walk and your spiritual faith to be able to apply gospel truths in your life. You're growing and you're learning in that, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's awesome. Be blessed in that, grow in that, enjoy your spiritual youth. But I think what tends to happen, and maybe you can connect with this too, is that you're young in your faith and maybe you're new to church, or maybe you go to youth retreat or whatever it is and you accept Christ, or there's some kind of rededication, recommitment in your life. And then when that happens, you see, I think what the devil knows is he can't really touch you. He can't really do anything to tempt you because you're just so on fire for God. Small group and worship, all these things is like new and exciting. And so you're enjoying God and you're enjoying church and you're enjoying church stuff. Give it like 4 months. Maybe your time frame is different. Give it like 3 or 4 months. And then you start to realize that there are some difficult things in church. And you realize that serving is not as enjoyable as it once was. You realize that being in a small group is not as enjoyable, is not as easy as it sounds. You thought that everyone is just going to be super encouraging and everyone is just on fire for God, and you find out everyone's jacked up like you. You find out that reading 5 verses in a Bible, trying to do your QT, and you don't understand it, and so you just close the Bible. You see, what happens in that process is you tend to quit really easily. You tend to kind of run away from it. You don't want to deal with the difficulty. You don't want to deal with the awkwardness. You don't want to deal with the challenge. You just kind of close it and you move on. And then you drift and then you drift and you're prone to wander. And so what we need to understand, if that's you, look at your Bibles. If what I just described was you, I need you to think and focus on verses 2 to 4. When James paints the reality that trials are real, that there's nothing wrong with you, that there's nothing wrong with God when you face trials in your life. When he says, count it all joy, I need you to wrestle through that. How in the world, God, can I count it all joy when my mother is sick? How can I count it all joy when I just got fired from my job? You see, these are things that you need to think about, because I think the reality for a lot of young believers is that they're unwilling to accept that trials are reality. They just want to believe that the Christian life is supposed to be this nice little bubble that God blesses me and He's full of grace, that I'm not going to be challenged in any sort of way. But James pops that bubble and he says, listen, I need you to believe this. God loves you enough that He's going to put you through trials. Don't quit. Don't run away. Stay in the fight. And if you mess up, there is grace. And if you succeed, there is grace. If you're, on the other hand, a little bit more seasoned than that, and maybe you've been through fire a little bit, you've had a bit of life experience, and you know that trials are real, and you know that they are necessary. If that's you, focus on verses 5 to 8. Go to God and ask for wisdom. I really hope that you don't wake up tomorrow morning, Monday, before you go to class or before you go to work, and your prayer is, dear God, give me wisdom, peace, and then you walk out. I really hope that's not your prayer. Unless Unless you're in tears by the end of that prayer, I really hope that's not your prayer. I really hope that as you ask God for wisdom, you can pause and you can think, you can reflect, that you can worship, that you go to God, not for a nugget of wisdom, but you go to God who is wisdom. That you don't use God, but that you worship God. And when James writes in verses 5 to 8, like don't be tossed by, the wind, and he's talking about faith, he's not talking about intellectual faith. He's not talking about, I didn't unpack this so much, but when James talks about faith, he's not saying if you don't have faith, God's not going to give it to you. I want to be careful when I say this, okay? Hear me when I say this. Do you really think that it's your faith that saved you? Do you really think that you mustered up some kind of spirituality in your life that God said, oh, look at you. Look at all this faith that you have. I'll save you. Do you really think that's what happened? You're in the mire. You're in the gutter. You're in spiritual darkness. And all you care for was about yourself. And it was God who gave you faith so that you could be saved. It is God who gives you faith. And if it's God who gives you faith, be firm in your convictions. Church, I want you to hear me. Believers, new believers and seasoned believers, I want you to hear me. Have the courage to follow your convictions. If you know that your relationship with Jesus is real, then follow through with it. Why come on Sundays and give this false righteousness and this false worship when you know Jesus is real? And you know your salvation is real, and you know that sanctification is real. Why be fake about that stuff? Be firm in your convictions and know that the cross is real. That what you read in the Bible is real. Even if you read 5 verses and you don't understand it, it is real. So what excuse then do we have to say, I'm going through a hard time, and you give these fake prayers, God, give me wisdom. Go to God and ask for wisdom and see your jacked upness, and that's okay because God gives you grace. My God, do we have a real relationship with Jesus? Don't tell me, do it. You know what I'm saying? Do it in your prayer life. Do it in your Bible reading. Do it in your church life. Be real in your relationship with, don't go to God and say, give me wisdom when you don't mean it. Go to God who is wisdom. If God saved you, my goodness, act it out. I mean, do you hear that tone? And do you hear what James is saying? The younger half-brother of Jesus witnessed his older brother being brutally murdered to the cross. And suddenly it occurred to him, my older brother is the Son of God. And I need to be filled with the Spirit so I can write this letter to the church who are being persecuted. And I need to tell them that the gospel is not just talking about faith, it is hands-on faith. Do we sense the weight of that, church? Are we really going to read a few verses and say, okay, I guess I just got to make a prayer? Honestly, church, let's be real with that. Can we practice the gospel and not just talk about it? Can we understand that the trials that we face are things that we don't just go through and cruise by, but we treat them as things that God has put in front of us to test the genuineness of our faith, as gold is refined in fire? Can we go to God in honest request and say, God, I need wisdom because there are things in this life that I don't understand. There are relationships that I don't get. There are things about church, there are things about work, there are things about family that I just don't know what to do. Instead of just saying, well, I just got to give up, I guess. I'm just going to run away from it. But can you be steadfast in that and say, God, I'm going to stick through it. Follow your convictions. Don't give up on that. I mean, hear James's tone. Hear him, not just what he says, but where it's coming from. Go to God in wisdom. Be firm in your faith. Have the courage to follow your convictions. Church, I'm going to say it again. Your relationship with Jesus is real. It is absolutely real. The gospel, and then it says that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, those are real. So let's act upon it. Let's be hands-on with that. Let's not just talk it, let's live it. Join me in prayer.